The little sign you see to the left of the cover of the book is the Maine 200 Leading the Way icon, and the book was accepted by the commission, the 200 Commission for the state of Maine, as one way of celebrating our 200th anniversary of statehood. So up until a year ago, they allowed us to put that logo on the books, but they said after that, they said, well, we're going to work on the 300th now. We're going to not worry about the 200th anymore. So what is the connection between the capitals of Maine and stagecoaching? Well, the main connection was that they both occurred at about the same time. About 1820, stagecoaching came into very wide use in Maine and Massachusetts. And at the same time, we were able to obtain our own statehood here in Maine and not be under the thumb of Boston anymore, which was really a good advantage. So here's the layout on the three principal capitals. There are some people that argue there were some others, but these are the main capitals. And every time I see a young person who's been in high school and studying history, I've asked them, do you know the three capitals of Maine? And a few of them did. I was really shocked. But Boston was from 1692 to 1820. And then Portland was 1820 to 1832. And in 1832, they decided that they would move the capital up to Augusta. And of course, it's been there ever since. The big problem in getting separation from Boston, from Massachusetts, was that we had two schools of thought here in the state of Maine. We had the school of thought that said, well, we really need Massachusetts. They're underwriting us to some extent. They're handling all of our imports and exports. So at the time, we also had two different newspapers. And it's nice that we were able to support two different points of view at that time. The Eastern Argus was for separation. They said, hey, we have enough population, we have sufficient means, we have sufficient talent, we will be able to cover the expense to separate, and there are many advantages to doing so. The Portland Gazette, on the other hand, was against it. They said the Republicans were blamed for the separation fever. The only problem is, in 1820, there was not a Republican Party per se. So exactly what they meant, I don't know, but that was the way it was written in their newspaper. It says also that the current growth and property came from Massachusetts. We didn't do any of it. If it were not from Massachusetts, we'd not be anywhere. And that Mainers were not smart enough or wealthy enough to run their own state. Guess we showed them, didn't we? Go ahead. This was the first state house in Boston. It was all made of wood. And you know what happens to houses or buildings that are made of wood when you have to have nice roaring fires to keep them warm enough in the winter? Invariably, something catches fire and they burn down. And this one did. This was the new capital for Maine, the State House for Massachusetts, on State Street. And all the ingredients for a stagecoach line are in this picture. We have a stage with horses pulling it. They're departing from a tavern. And we have the roads, which you can see. And we even have a destination, getting to Boston. The main thing we needed, though, was good roads. Now, Massachusetts thought about that starting about 1800. They knew that if they didn't build roads to the interior, the rest of the state would never develop. They had the population and they had the money to build toll roads from Boston to anywhere in that state. So that's what they did. The one that we're most concerned about is the Newbury Turnpike. That was the first step toward connecting Boston to Maine and New Hampshire. And it was completed in the fall of 1806. The next step was to get from Salisbury to Portsmouth and Kittery. Of course, at every river, like the Merrimack and at the Piscataqua, there had to be either a bridge or a ferry if you expected to get across. So the first was across the Merrimack, and then the Piscataqua, but the latter one didn't come in until 1823. So we were a state by the time you could actually travel across that bridge. A ferry was used in its place, and they were used quite frequently. Okay. This red arrow pointing up shows you how straight the Newbury Turnpike was. They wanted it to be as straight as possible from Boston to Newburyport. They did a pretty good job of it. In fact, they kind of ignored the fact that there were hills in the way. They went over the top of the hills. There were valleys in the way. They went down to the bottom of the valleys. They didn't have any construction equipment in those days except what could be pulled by oxen or horses or dug by men. So their only hope was just to make the road straight, and whoever was traveling on it would suffer the consequences. Go ahead. This was the first bridge over the Merrimack, which has a very interesting feature. And both of the spans are not level. You notice how they're bowed up. And there was a very good reason for that. If they bowed the span, then they could take a heavier load over that distance of span, because some of the force was diverted into the pilings on the end. So the early bridges, that was very common. Also, the sort of guardrail that they had also helped to disperse the forces a little bit. Here's the pile bridge from Portsmouth to Kittery in 1823, and again, very short spans, lots of piles. They must have taken years to pound all those into the river bottom. And the picture obviously was taken at a later date when they had probably telegraph lines going across the bridge. The important thing to know is that although we were interested in building roads in Maine by that point, most of the travel in Maine prior to that was done by boat. If you think about it, the earliest settlements were all either on the ocean or on a river. The closest we came here was the King's Highway, which ran from all the way from Kittery up to Wiscasset. And what little traffic there was on the King's Highway. In fact, there's a record of John Adams coming up to conduct a court session in Maine, and his impressions of traveling over the King's Highway, especially in Maine. We did have a turnpike, or at least we had plans for a turnpike. The first Maine turnpike, going from Kittery to Portland and on to Augusta. The only problem was they couldn't negotiate with the people that had already built the bridge across the Fall River to get to Portland. So they just never even turned over one spade. No ground was moved. Nothing ever happened from that first version, which dates all the way back to 1802. The only turnpike we had between Portsmouth and Portland up until 1947 was 1.5 miles long, and it was called the Cumberland Turnpike. And now it's called Payne Road in Scarborough. Well, once we had the roads underway, we had to get stage lines developed. This was the only form of public transportation in that day. The first person to take it on was Bartholomew Stavers in 1761. So before the Revolutionary War, we actually had stages that went from Boston as far as Portsmouth. He was a very interesting character. He was a staunch Tory, and his mantra was, steady adherence to government, and oppose the lawless conduct of the Americans. We won't have any of that. His nephew, William Stavers, and Josiah Payne, who Payne Road was named after, kept the stages running, and by 1800 offered a daily trip from Boston to Portland. So as early as 1800, we did have a way to get. Now, we say these were stage lines, but at that time, a stage could be even an open wagon where there were benches set up in the back of it, no cover. If it was raining, you got wet. Payne was the first example of what a good entrepreneur would do if he owned a stage line, or actually Payne owned a tavern in Portland. And if you own a tavern, what's the important question is, how do you get people to your tavern? Well, if you own a tavern and you own the stage line, it's pretty darn easy. You make sure your stagecoach stops at the tavern. And that's the way to make the maximum return on your investment. A little later, Benjamin Hale and his father Jacob started a stage line which merged in 1818 with a few other small lines to form the Eastern Stage Company. And this was the biggest stage company in Massachusetts at the time. They had two different forms of stages. They had the mail stage and the accommodation stage. Now, passengers could travel on either one, but if you can imagine, a mail stage had to stop at every little town, every little village along the way and deliver the mail. The passengers would get rather tired of stopping and starting and stopping and starting, so they fixed up an accommodation stage. It was more like a non-stop between major points. The Eastern Stage was headquartered at Newburyport, Massachusetts, but their charter was from New Hampshire. They had routes in Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. They were quite an amazing company for that era. They were totally free of debt by 1833. They employed 500 men. They owned hotels, taverns, stables, and blacksmith shops. So they had the whole system locked up until the Eastern Railroad came along. It was chartered in 1836, and that spelled the end of the golden era for the Eastern Stage Company. The trains could carry you from point A to point B several times faster and at less expense. Taverns were the next most important thing to have en route. They were what you would consider today a commodity. Travelers by any means would have to have a place that they could rest and drink and eat, because remember, things moved much slower in those days. Typically, a stagecoach would travel 4 to 6 miles per hour. So if you were traveling from here to Boston, it's a 2-day trip. Not 2 hours, 2 days. It was interesting that they often located the taverns next to a church. Why did they do that? Well, some people said the church members wanted to keep an eye on the activities at the tavern, which makes sense. But on the other hand, the churchgoers also needed a place to catch a hot grog after spending a winter's day in a cold and damp church. So it worked both ways, to both advantages. And the taverns were positioned strategically wherever the horses had to be changed, which was typically about 12 miles. So if you were traveling 4 miles per hour, you'd ride for 3 miles, and then you'd have a little rest stop, you'd change horses, you could have a quick drink of something or a bite to eat, and you'd be on your way. Let's take a look at some of the taverns that were along the way. This is the Grapes Tavern in Boston, and judging from the little boat, teeth of the boat, you can see in the background, it must have been very near the waterfront. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but it was a good example. And the taverns were used not only for the stage lines, they were also used as a stopping point for the ships. And quite often, reservations to take a ship or to take a stage would be, the reservation books would be held inside the tavern. Okay. This is the next one up the coast at Newburyport. Well, that's not actually the next one. This is the next really interesting one. This one was named after General Wolfe, who died in combat in the French and Indian Wars when the British were trying to take Quebec. This particular one is located in Portsmouth, and it was interesting because this was the Earl of Halifax Tavern. And if you can imagine, during the Revolutionary War, Earl of Halifax was not a very welcomed individual. So they had to change the name. And so they changed the name to the William Pitt because he was very favorable to the revolutionaries. And this tavern was owned by the brother of the first stage driver, William Staver, and he had a lot of problems with, well, there were two brothers. One ended up, the Tory went to England during the Revolutionary War, and the other brother stayed, but they came and they were going to run him out of town on a rail because he was a Tory. And so what he did, he got word of that and left early enough to avoid that embarrassment, and went into New Hampshire in hiding, and came back a little later, and he signed an agreement that he would go along with the revolutionary. He would become a patriot as well. This one is, we got the title in there. This is the Rice Tavern and the ferry landing on the opposite side from Portsmouth. This gentleman, again, very enterprising. He didn't have a stage line, but he ran the ferry boat, and of course the ferry boat delivered the customers to his tavern. So if you wanted a night out on the town from Portsmouth, I guess you could take the ferry over and use the tavern in Kittery. This one is of particular interest. This one right now, the Broad Tavern, is somewhere under the parking lot, one of the parking lots at the airport. They had to tear it down to build the part of the airport. But it has really an interesting story that goes along with it. That big elm tree right in front, at one time, had a circular tree house around it. And of course, they had a fence, the guardrail around the outside of the tree house, steps up to the tree house, and they would serve drinks. So they called it the Tree Tavern as opposed to the Broad Tavern. And what would happen on weekends is the local men would gather there for a drink, and they would play cards out on this tree house. Well, one Saturday night, one of the players said, I feel really embarrassed about playing into Sunday morning, playing cards into Sunday morning. So I have an idea. He said, let's take whatever money is made in the card game after midnight to the local pastor and donate it to the church. Oh, the guys thought that was great. The only problem with it was when they were ready to go about 3 o'clock in the morning, they said, well, now we have to wake the pastor up to give him the money. It was the pastor from Westbrook, and he didn't live too far from this. But if we wake him up, he's not going to be happy about that, and he's probably even going to be less happy about hearing that we've been playing cards at this hour of the night on the Sabbath. So the thought was, we'll just put the money on the porch, we'll knock on the door, and we'll run as fast as we can. Well, the pastor was a little quicker. He must have seen him coming. So he was there at the door, and they explained everything that happened to him, everything and what their thought was. And the pastor said, well, God doesn't care where the money comes from. The church doesn't really mind. As long as the money comes to us, we're in good shape. Okay. This is the Elm House in Portland, and it's the same tavern that was shown on the cover of the book. And you can see from this that they're called taverns. This is called a house, but they're really an inn or a hotel. And it's obviously just for a tavern, you wouldn't need that much real estate or that much building. but they would have rooms for travelers. And again, travelers that came by sea or by stage would stay at the Elm House. And the books were kept at the Elm House for the stagecoach travel. Go ahead. This is the second capital for Maine. This is actually the State House in Portland. It was at the corner of Congress and Myrtle Streets. Unfortunately, in the Great Fire of 1666, it burned down too. But for 12 years, between 1820 and 1832, this was the capital of Maine. Well, for that 12 years, I think they spent about as much time discussing where the capital should be located as they actually did legislating. The first thought was, well, what's wrong with Portland? We're here. We have a place. We can do it right here. Of course, everyone from all the other counties and towns and everything had to come down to Portland. So someone brought up the fact that during the Revolutionary War, Portland was actually shelled by the British. A lot of people don't realize that either. It was a good target, and we got, we were the Ukraine at that time. They were concerned about the per diem cost. How much would it cost to put up with the legislators? It would be pretty expensive in Portland. And like Boston, it was very wealthy and influential. They're going to have too much control over the whole state legislature if we locate in Portland. And it should be located more centrally in the state. So someone said, well, what about Augusta? Or what about Hallowell? So they discussed it, and they said, well, Augusta has accommodations for us. And then the Augusta merchants got wind of the fact that it might possibly come to Augusta. So right away, they donated a 30-acre parcel to build a new capital on. The deal was sealed. We were ready to go. Let's put our capital in Augusta, 30 acres. So here is the famous painting of the Capitol in Augusta with the cows grazing in the pasture. And that's how it looked in the 1800s. This was an interesting building that was built in Portland, 1845. They had become they were getting used to the idea that the capital was going to be in Augusta. But a lot of the merchants here, and of course the legislators from here and southern Maine, who had to travel all the way to Augusta, by stagecoach, by the way, thought, well, it would be really nice to have the capital here in Portland. So they built the Portland Exchange building. And it was quite an elegant building. It was all made out of marble from Maine, and the dome was copper-topped, which you didn't see very often in that day. Well, it didn't work. They didn't have any luck with it, and it too burned, or was actually gutted by fire in the 1860s. So now that we've come all the way from Boston to Portland, now we have to get to Augusta. So we have to build some roads. We did get 3 turnpikes built. And by the way, a turnpike came from the 2 words turn and pike. And a pike was a weapon that was used in the medieval days for someone on horseback would carry this long shaft with the weapon head on the end of it. And so what they would do is they would put that horizontally on a vertical stand, and they would swing it in and out as a gate to let people go in and out. So they called it a turnpike. Okay, first we had to get to Brunswick. And this is the way we went to Brunswick. We had to get out of the neck of Portland. We started in Portland. And until there were bridges built, until Tukey's Bridge was built in 1796, and until we had the Martin's Point Bridge at a later date, in the 1800s, the only way you could get out of Portland was over the neck. So you had to go south to start with, and southwest, and then come up, and you'd travel from Portland to Falmouth, to North Yarmouth, to Freeport, and to Brunswick. And Tukey's Bridge got us shortened the route by allowing us to go across the Back Bay. And then the Presumpscot River we had early on in Falmouth, which was good because that was the bridge that was used from the earliest time. And then the Royal River Bridge near the falls was built at about 1800. I'm sorry, not near the falls, it was upstream a little bit. You can show by the little curve in the dots there. Okay, now we'll get on the one I was talking about before. Okay, here's our 3 turnpikes. We have, the first one was Wiscasset to Woolwich, and at the same time, about the same time, we got from Wiscasset to Augusta. Well, this is kind of interesting because we have the Kennebec River in the way. If you want to go from Portland to Augusta, you have to cross the Kennebec to get to Wiscasset, or to get to Woolwich and then Wiscasset. And then you have to cross it from the east side to get back to Augusta, which is on the west side of the Kennebec River. So they started thinking very early on, well, they always wanted to shorten the routes because obviously it was easier on the passengers of a shorter route, less road to maintain, and it would cost the stagecoach owners less money to travel a shorter distance. Here's the Kennebec, again with the familiar arch on each of the spans. It was originally built to connect Augusta and Hallowell to northern Maine, but it became a key link in the Wiscasset to Augusta Turnpike. Now, when we call these turnpikes, we also have to be very careful because basically they were dirt roads, but they were at least a road. You didn't have to go between 2 tightly together growing trees. You had room to do it. You had room to go 2 directions at once usually, and but not anything like what we think of turnpikes today. In fact, the earliest really paved roads came in quite a bit later. We also had to get across the Kennebec was Day's Ferry, and that was the only way to cross the Kennebec near the coast. And it had been in operation since before the Revolution, since 1762. In the winter, of course, they couldn't drive the ferry boats across because there was just enough ice to get in the way. So what they did was they went upstream far enough to where the river was frozen over completely, and they'd cross the stagecoaches there. And they have an interesting story about one time that happened. Fortunately, nobody fell in the river, but knowing that the ice was getting thin, they ran the horses across first. They figured they could lose the horses easier than they could lose the passengers. So they got the horses across safely, and then they found some schoolboys, some high school kids or whatever, that were willing to earn a few pennies and push the stagecoach across the river, roll it over. They took the place of the horses. So they pushed it over. Everyone got over to the other side safely. But the next morning, there was no more ice. So they came very, very close to not getting across the river. And by 1837, the stream-driven ferries were used. And it's ironic because it was the steam engine, as applied to the railroads, that actually took the stagecoaches out of business. So if we didn't want to cross the Kennebec twice, we'd have to have a better route. And sure enough, they came up with a couple better routes. The earliest route came up, of course, the west side of the Kennebec to avoid crossing it. But you had to build the road in order to do that. Later, they found a little bit better route that came up further to the west of the Kennebec River. And these routes, they saved the 2 crossings, but the roads that we drive today are pretty much the same roads. Okay, we're going to start how do we get the stage lines going now? Okay, Caleb Graffam, 1793, went all the way from Portland to Wiscasset to Hallowell, which was quite an adventure. And his, definitely in the early days, was open, and it was an open sleigh in the wintertime. You know, these guys, it didn't bother them any to be out, you know, for hours and hours and hours in the snow and fighting the drifts. In 1796, Joseph Stockbridge went from Portland to Bath, and I have a little star by the ones that actually also owned taverns at one end of the line or the other. Henry McIntyre in 1803, he went from Portland to Brunswick. He didn't have a tavern, but he owned a corral for the horses. Thomas Estabrook in 1806 went from Brunswick to Augusta. So the competition was pretty thick in those days. William B. Peters in 1821 from Portland to Bath. But the important group, and the ones that formed the Maine Stage Company, Russell Stoddard, Samuel Hale, and Israel Waterhouse. Stoddard was from Brunswick, and Hale and Waterhouse were from Portland. And Stoddard had a tavern in Brunswick, and the other two had a tavern, actually owned and built the Elm House in Portland. If you wanted to find out when the stages would be running, you would look for this little icon at the top of the stage with 4 horses, stage and 4, and it would tell you all the latest Stagecoach information. And you would find this all over the advertising pages in the newspapers of the day. And this particular one was before they took on the name of the Maine Stage Company, and they called it the Augusta Stage Line. And it's the same 3 gentlemen. Okay, the Maine Stage Company was established in 1823. It was the largest stage company to work in Maine. And they offered service from Portland to Bath and then from Brunswick to Augusta. They had a very interesting concept, kind of like what we expect from airline pilots today, total temperance. These guys were not supposed to drink under any circumstances. And they actually signed a contract with the owners of the stage lines. Because prior to that, it had been a very common habit that the stage driver would take a flask with him. And sometimes the passengers on the stage would have to get out and drive the stage because the driver just couldn't handle it. The stage lines themselves were run by very honorable men who were pillars in their community. These guys were not only just churchgoers, they participated in town government, they volunteered for everything imaginable. They really were into becoming public servants, and the stage lines were pretty much just an extension of it. Of course, they did make a little money on it. In 1835, they built the Stage Tavern in North Yarmouth, which of course encompassed all of Yarmouth and North Yarmouth at the time, near the falls. And it was used as the stage stop between Falmouth and Freeport. Again, 12 miles more or less between. The last hurrah before the trains came in was they decided to have a race to see who could get mail from the East Coast to Montreal the quickest. So in 1846, they set up a test. And they had run one earlier in the fall, which was advantageous. Things hadn't frozen up yet. But that didn't work out too well because Boston had a tremendous advantage and got there days before Maine did, because they got the mail first, and then we had to get it second, and then we had to go up. So somebody probably paid them to slow down the mail between Boston and Portland. The same guy that's paying it today to mess up our mail service, probably. But they decided that the only fair way to do it was to meet the boat bringing the mail. Actually, it was coming from France. To meet the mail out in the Atlantic at a place that was equidistant from Boston and Portland. And then they would bring the mail to the port, and then they would go by relay up to Montreal. Well, by then it had snowed, And they had to deal with that. So you can imagine running a race with a sleigh pulled by 4 horses all the way from Portland to Montreal. So they started out, and they had a few problems, a few spills along the way, but they made it there, and they made it, if you can believe this, in 26 hours on a sleigh pulled by horses. So they were going well over 6 miles an hour. But they didn't have to worry about insurance or safety at all. The idea was to win. So they actually did win, the ones from Portland. They were given the key to Montreal by the mayor, the driver was, and somebody yelled out from the crowd, "Well, where's the Boston guy?" And the people from Montreal said, "We don't know. We haven't heard anything more from him." And it took them several days more to get to Montreal. But the Maine Stage Company finally closed their doors and sold off all the materials in 1849 after the long runs had been replaced by the railroads. So now we have to talk about the stage taverns along the river routes. Again, we have to stop about every 12 miles. From Wiscasset to Augusta, which was approximately Route 27, we needed only one stop at Dresden Mills. If we were going from Bath or Brunswick to Augusta, the early route, approximately Route 24, required 2 stops, Bodenham and near Gardner. If you were going to Bath or Brunswick on the later route, Bath or Brunswick to Augusta on the later route, which was approximately Route 201, required 2 stops, again, Bodenham and Richmond. Of course, there were many taverns in every town, just like we have a lot of bars today, but there were taverns, but only very few were stage stops. They had to be strategically located at the right place for the stage to stop. And of course, every time they shortened the route, some tavern owners were left out in the cold, and some new ones were hastily building a new tavern. And again, the tavern owners, just like the stage drivers, had to be upstanding men in their community. They were very carefully monitored. There would be someone who would come around at a certain hour. This is closing hour. If you're not closed, you're going to be fined. And everybody that's in the tavern is going to be fined along with you. And it was not unusual to find the tavern near a church. Here's a good example. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Bachelor Tavern in Litchfield, but this picture was taken just a couple years ago. The postcard on the right has the same tavern with a church right across the street. Now, when I was up there, the church wasn't there anymore, but the tavern had survived. and I guess there wasn't any need to keep an eye on the tavern anymore. This is the predominant tavern in Bath, the Bath Hotel, opened in 1806. And it was the principal stage house in Bath, just like the Elm House was in Portland. And all the books for the boats going up the Kennebec River and for the seagoing boats for travel were kept here, as well as the Stagecoach books. This is another tavern that was in Bath, and it was the Shepherd's Inn. The outstanding thing here was that the walls were lined with very elegant Italian wallpaper. And it was so appreciated and recognized for its value that when they tore this tavern down, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston came and paid to get all the woodwork and the wallpaper and some of the fixtures, and they reconstructed the lobby, the entrance room for the tavern at the Fine Arts Museum in Boston. I don't know if it's still open. It was closed for several years, but they did it. They had it open for a long time. In Woolwich, of course, you had to have a tavern right across from Day's Ferry, just like the Ferry and Kittery, the ferry owner owned the tavern. So he would take the occupants of the ferry boat, the customers on the stagecoach, over to his tavern and make sure that they got a good send-off before they went on to the next stop. This is the Peacock Tavern in Richmond, which you probably noticed. It's on 201, I think it is, going up out of Brunswick. Beautiful place on the inside. We had the opportunity to take a look at the inside of the original beams that were built into this place, and it's really very well constructed. A lot of work went into it. Now we have the problem of Augusta and Hallowell. We have two towns, one that was always the winner, and poor Hallowell always seemed to be the loser. They were separated shortly after they were born, and they ended up pursuing very divergent roles. Augusta became the seat of the state government, while Hallowell was a commercial center. So travelers needing to participate in government went to Augusta, while merchants picked Hallowell as a destination. Fortunately, they were very close together. The people in Hallowell were smart, though. They said, well, I don't think we have anyone in Augusta that's big enough to handle all the legislators. So if there's some overflow, or if all of them want to stay in one place, we'll build a 70-room hotel, the Hallowell House, in 1832, same year that the legislators arrived in Augusta. This is an advertisement out of a newspaper for the Augusta House and for the Kennebec House, which were two competing hotels in Augusta. And one had a large livery stable, so they advertised for that too. But it's kind of interesting to see ads for two competing places to be, back to back like that. Okay, winter traveling in Maine, always a problem. We have some marvelous stories that are in the book about experiences the people did on Stagecoach, actual records that were kept. And this particular one, he recorded that clearing the roads was okay from Brunswick to Topsom, but in Richmond, they were stuck in drifts as high as the coach. So what do? Well, you get all the neighboring people and any oxen you can find, and you try to get the coach out of the drifts. So the oxen came to the rescue, but even the oxen couldn't pull the stagecoach out. So some hospitable neighbors took all the passengers in overnight. Can you imagine that? You have a flat tire out on the highway, and you go and you spend the night at whoever's house is closest. Great system. The next morning, they finally made it to the Peacock Tavern, but it took them 3 yoke of oxen to travel that 8 miles. And the driver was looking for the road agent, driver of the stagecoach, and he found a young boy, and he cried out to the boy. He said, "Who is the road agent in this district?" And the little boy says, "Oh, my father." "Well, you tell your father if he doesn't break out this road before I come along again, I will welt his hide well." "Where is he now?" "Oh, gone to meeting." Of course, that meant church meeting. Answered the little towhead. "Well," says Jabe, which was kind of the nickname for the driver, "he ought to be at meeting the rest of his days if he has not performed his other duties better than those of road agent. Remember and tell him what I say." "Yes, sir." This was a young man from Augusta, Daniel Coney. He's fairly familiar to the people from the Kennebec Valley, who was considered fairly daring. He went out at a fairly young age. He wanted to go see what life was like in the big city, so he went down to Boston. On his way back, he took the boat, and he'd planned to take the boat all the way to Augusta. But as he neared Portland, they warned that there was a nor'easter coming. So he changed his plans and decided to stay at the Elm House overnight and take the stage out the next morning. So he documented all this, of course. Stagecoach, he says, that stagecoach travel was the jolliest ever invented. Nothing was more exhilarating than a stagecoach journey. And now present travel forbids general conversation, which is true to some extent. He sat with the driver who was full of marvelous stories. We can't sit in the co-pilot's seat and talk to the pilot about the good old days, but you could on a stagecoach. And they had the stage lines, the stagecoaches, the particular routes arranged so that they would stop at midday at the Tontine Hotel in Brunswick, which is pictured in the lower left, for a meal. So the stages arriving from Augusta would stop there, and the stages coming up from Portland would stop there. And they would eat together, just more, better group. And he says, who were as jolly as we, the other passengers. And he arrived in Augusta at 6 p.m. after an 11-hour trip. 11 hours, the whole day was spent. Boom, 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 boom. Go ahead. We always had to worry about the dangers on the road. We have some good stories about the Lambert Bridge, which was near the Lambert Tavern right at the bottom of Blackstrap Road. And they had a bridge there that was wide enough for 2 lanes, and it had a divider down the center. The problem with Blackstrap Hill is that the horses would come running down that, and unless the driver really kept them under close rein, they could break away, and they'd just love to run down that hill as fast as they could. Well, this one time, they got to the bridge, and the left horse went to the left, and the right one went to the right. So you can imagine what happened. The stagecoach survived, but the animals were actually injured very badly. Another example is that the horses would run away. You can imagine if the driver had to get out to hand a mailbag to somebody in a town, he would leave nobody on the driver's seat, maybe. And what happens if somebody comes along with a Model T or something and scares them? Well, the horses take off, and there's no way to stop the stage from the inside. Another problem was fire. And in the winter, it was very typical for the ladies who were traveling to stay warm to have a little firebox that they would put down on the floor to keep their feet warm. The only problem was some of the more gallant stagecoach drivers would put hay on the floor. And the hay would serve as kind of an insulation. I don't know if you've ever sat on hay when it's cold out, it's not bad. But unfortunately, the firebox and the hay don't mix too well. So sometimes the stage would catch on fire from these fireboxes. And they'd have to get everybody out and put the fire out. Another thing was upsetting the stage. If you can imagine, the stage has a pretty high center of gravity, and it doesn't take much swaying back and forth before the stagecoach will tip over. And there was a legislator from the Berwick area who was heading for Augusta, and the stage he was riding in had to pull over for a stage coming the other direction. And in getting back on the road, it's tipped over. Well, unfortunately, he was on the downhill side as a passenger, and sitting next to him were 2 very large men. And this guy wasn't too big. So by the time he survived. By the time he got to Augusta, he wrote his wife a letter and said, told her what happened. He said, nothing much happened, but I just saw stars for about 15 minutes. Lightning strikes, of course, would spur the horses on. Snowdrifts would stop everything. Downhills were dangerous. Blackstrap Road is the prime example. And even the way it's built today, we still have accidents, fatal accidents, on curves on Blackstrap Road. Robberies were not very prevalent here, but out west where I've also written a couple stagecoach books about Arizona and Montana, they were very prevalent. Go Okay, they had to take some measures to improve safety. And we mentioned about the no way for the passengers to stop runaway horses from inside. That somebody got smart and actually patented an inside brake that would be connected to the outside brake. So if the passengers felt something disadvantageous was going on, they could stop the coach from inside. The company's regulations for the drivers were very, very strict. They had to control the number of passengers. This actually is a picture from out west, but this is how they would load the stagecoach up. You could put 4 or 5 people up on top, 2 others besides the driver on the driver's seat, and you'd stuff as many as could fit inside. And of course, it was fine if the roof didn't break and everybody fell down inside, or if the thing didn't tip over. But if it did, you could have a lot of injuries. So they decided that wasn't a good idea. Then the other thing was to be thoughtful to the horses. Since I know there's a lot of people who are interested in horses here, being humane to the horses, they decided was paramount to being able to control the horses in a disadvantageous situation. Go ahead. Points to remember about stagecoach traveling. It began in earnest around 1820. Same year, Maine became a state. Upon the advent of the train, the travel by stagecoach was up until that time, it was the only public transportation on land. And the trains really took it all away from the long runs. Actually, the stages ran for a while after the trains came in, because you couldn't get everywhere on a train that you could get to on a stagecoach. They became more like taxi cabs, going out to suburban areas and things. If the opportunity occurs, do not pass up the chance to take a ride on a stagecoach. You will gain great admiration for our ancestors and their forbearance. And I do have some books for sale if anyone's interested in the back. Thank you very much.